Welcome to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, your host, and today I have the honor of speaking with Ocean Vuong on our 50th episode. Ocean is the author of the critically acclaimed poetry collections Night Sky with Exit Wounds and Time is a Mother, as well as the New York Times bestselling novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. A recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship and the American Book Award, Ocean used to work as a fast food server, which inspired The Emperor of Gladness, his most recent book. Born in Saigon in Vietnam, he currently splits his time between Northampton, Massachusetts, and New York City. Ocean, I'm so glad to see you here.
Oh, always good to see you, big brother. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's like the last time we talked was actually in person, which is always better, but at least here we get to have an audience of people coming in from all over the world. This is a diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian arts show, and we really see it with our attendees. The last time we spoke was in 2017 in Los Angeles at the Public Library. I believe On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous had just come out at the time. And I don't know if anyone could really anticipate the way that your career and your writing and your persona just really took off in a meteoric trajectory. And you were recently selected as one of Time 100's most influential people, and I had the pleasure of writing some comments for that. And the way that I described you, and maybe you don't agree, so we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but I described your style and your persona as one of radical vulnerability, which is something that I feel that, can be interpreted as weakness, but in our current time, where even empathy is under attack by certain parts of our country and all over the world, radical vulnerability can be a source of strength as well. Do you agree that you personify or embody or perform radical vulnerability?
I think everything is relative, and I think any vulnerability in America is radical because we are taught that, as we're seen by not just this administration, but American imperialism at large, that everything was about strength, defense as strength first, protection through strength, and also just on a deeper psychological level. I watched growing up, and in a way, I'm an immigrant, but I'm also a product of this country. I was raised here. I consumed the fast food, the art, the music, and I was surrounded by what I saw was this kind of very fragile armor that men and boys were taught to put on, and in order to hide, their truer selves. And I think people often say, how can you be so vulnerable? It must be so hard. And I think vulnerability is not something you make or do. It's already there. If you talk to anybody for 20 minutes, you realize how vulnerable they are. You realize that there's most of their motivations are around fear, love, the fear of losing love, the fear of themselves, their communities, their families. And so most of people's decisions, the way they come across are these kind of performances, these masks, a la Judith Butler. And once these things dissolve, or when you give people permission to let them dissolve, you realize that everyone is truly, really vulnerable. We are a soft species. We are a vulnerable species. We don't come like armadillos with armor. So I think it makes a lot of sense that we have reacted with a kind of psychic or metaphoric armor in order to move through the world. And it's ever so clear here in America, a place where the mythology of this place, the folklore of America, is a kind of hagiography around the founding fathers who have to be infallible and strong, or else the whole project falls apart. If you look at the reality, I learned about George Washington, for example, and the quirky tidbit that I learned about him growing up in New England was that he had wooden teeth. And then you realize later on that quirky tidbit was to hide, was a lie that hid the much sinister reality, was that his teeth was made from enslaved people's teeth. And so I think we're always confronting this sort of Mount Rushmore of strength and power. But I think I see that as kind of like small dick energy, quote unquote. And I don't mean that in any, jokey or crass way, but what I'm saying is that if you need something like Mount Rushmore, that is to deface a natural, mountain in order to showcase the strength, something inside you, deep down, that reality, that infallible strength was not really there to begin with. You somewhere deep down, you know that this country is founded on the attempt of Native American genocide and stolen bodies from Africa. And so I think for me, there's a kind of awareness in that. And what I'm interested in my work is using language to kind of take down that armor, to showcase what's already there.
I think that for many of us who have spent a lot of time thinking about the conditions of the United States, your analysis is very resonant. And perhaps we take some satisfaction in thinking that the people who are exercising the violence, and both rhetorically, but also physically, militarily, politically, and so on, are in some ways deeply vulnerable at their core. But that doesn't help the fact that when they act out and when they enact policies, people die. People are exploited as a result of it. So in some ways, it's perhaps a little bit of a cold comfort to think that some of the most unempathetic and most powerful people in this country may be vulnerable on the inside. But the other issue a couple of other issues that you raised, one of them is, coming as an immigrant or as a refugee or as the descendant of immigrants or refugees, there's a temptation to participate in this grand narrative coming from the founding fathers and so on, while refusing to acknowledge complicity that so many of us who come to the United States or as immigrants or refugees or who are descended from them are complicit in so many ways in some of the problems of this country, whether it's internal exploitation of poor and working class people, or whether it's our imperialistic and genocidal policies. And it's actually sometimes difficult for people who are so-called minorities to acknowledge that. And I think that is a part of what vulnerability means, is to acknowledge our complicity, that we're not just going to celebrate the mythology and the successes that we've had, but we're also going to acknowledge our complicity. Now, the other thing that you raised is that, to be vulnerable is to acknowledge what's something that's universal in all of us. But there's a difference in what you do compared to a lot of people who are willing to acknowledge their vulnerability, which is that for a lot of people, when they acknowledge their vulnerability, it's just purely to draw attention to themselves. And perhaps not all of us want to spend time with that. But I think you've taken your vulnerability, not just to acknowledge your own vulnerability, but to acknowledge that you're listening and paying attention to the vulnerability of others, both through your writing, but also through engagements like this. Why is it so difficult, if you agree with me, for people to not just acknowledge their own vulnerability, but to acknowledge other people's vulnerability?
Well, it's hard. I think it's scary. It means, I think so much of Western understanding of the material world is motivated by a fear of death. And this goes back to Plato. Like Plato's fantasy was to deny the body, to live only in the mind, right? Plato believed that beyond all the material, all this is hallucination, according to Plato, that everything had a true form, that the world was a world of shadows, and that intellect and rationality, which is why Plato launched a fascistic idea of the republic, right? To ban the poets. Why did he ban the poets? Was because he was afraid that poetry would corrupt the moral, a stoic fiber of the guardian class, aka the military class, right? So if you are, and by the way, Plato's republic was only 30,000 people. So I happen to live in a town of 30,000 people. And so if you are such a small population and art and music corrupts your military class and makes them feel empathetic, worried, or move them to fight injustice, then they will no longer protect the aristocracy, which Plato belonged, most likely slave owning. And so he believed in this idea that there could be good knowledge being knowledge that is fixed. But writing is not finite. He wanted writing to behave like math. He wanted the triangle version of literature. Not possible, right? A triangle will always be a triangle across time, but a poem changes based on the language, based on who's reading it, based on history. And so he thought, let's get good literature that will benefit the Republic. Once we have that canon, we'll just remove any new work. And you see Hitler attempted that project, Stalin, Pol Pot, and now we're seeing it right now with book bans. So I think the fear, all of this is based on the hallucination that we can live forever. Like the fear of death is so strong. And I think as a Buddhist, I'm always a Buddhist first, both in priority and temporally, Buddhist for before I'm a writer. And to me, if I look at the work of Thầy Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, or even Siddhartha Gautama, the historic Buddha, they saw autobiographical biography, lived experience as part of samsara, which is all part of this human realm. So there's no like possessiveness to it, you know. And similarly, I don't see like, oh, this is my experience. It is part of my persona or mythos. The culture does that. The media can do that, and you can't. It's just America. They'll take that and they'll package it accordingly. But you know, you think of Thich Nhat Hanh releasing his diaries in his lifetime, super vulnerable politically. You know, he got a lot of flack on that because he was calling things to action, but he had to insist on not choosing a side because he believed in the interconnectedness of karma, that if I choose a side, I will then have to eliminate the other side, and I will just start to create, you know, my own karma again, because I'm going to be reborn onto the other side, right? And so the idea of experience was just everything that is moved through by a human being. And I think that is very strange for the West to understand, because immediately it's like, why would you say all of that about yourself? Why would you reveal all of that? But to me, that is part of being alive, going back to the historic Buddha, to Thich Nhat Hanh, but also in our diaspora, particularly in the Vietnamese diaspora. Every Sunday you go to the temple, you'll hear a sermon or a talk by a monk or a nun, and very casually they'll start mentioning the war, what they've done, the bomb, the first time I heard bombs being described was at the temple. It was just a sermon, you know, a talk by a monk. And then you realize that, oh, it's not just like literary autofiction, which is very niche, elitist idea, but in fact, it's how our communities shared and bonded and gave each other tools of survival through acknowledging that, no, you are not crazy. You saw the bombs too. The napalm looked like this. And so coming from like the Buddhist perspective and the Vietnamese diasporic perspective first, that I'm using those strategies into literary fiction rather. So I often bristle whenever, you know, critics or journalists say, oh, he's working in autofiction. Like, yes, but that's a small niche towards a much larger kind of non-literary approach that I'm also leaning on.
You know, I was raised a Catholic, and in some ways, I think that undoubtedly, even though I'm an atheist, the mythology of Catholicism and the narratives of suffering and sacrifice and redemption and this afterlife of utopia has influenced my fiction and the way that I write. And so, your take, you know, with Buddhism and form, like how does your spirituality affect the way that you think of your writing is really compelling. And when you brought up Thich Nhat Hanh and then this idea of autofiction, I think, you know, when you read some of Thich Nhat Hanh's writings, I haven't read as much as you have, but the line between spirituality, poetry, prose is extremely thin in his work. I mean, you could reclassify some of his work and say that's autofiction, and it probably wouldn't appear that much different from what's being marketed in the United States. So you've published not too long ago this new novel, The Emperor of Gladness. It is about a a Vietnamese American college dropout who finds himself in a situation where he is becoming a caregiver, but also a friend to a Lithuanian refugee named Grazina, who's on the edge of dementia. And he's also trying to survive economically by finding a job at a fast food chain. And we are exposed to a whole panoply of co-workers who are all struggling with their own fates and in life. So can you tell us how what you've just said about autofiction, about Buddhism, about spirituality, and how does that affect the writing of this particular novel?
Hmm. Well, I think often I'm asked, you know, what facts about your life do you wove or weave into your work? And I'm not shy about that. You know, I always say that Moby Dick was an autobiographical work as well. And so I reject this idea that a lot of American artists have, which is the fantasy that art just comes from nowhere, right? And again, it comes from the Western ideal. Like, you know, when Homer wrote the Iliad, he pleaded with the muses, please help me, give me divine sort of blessing to do it. Milton too. I'm here to convey the ways of God to man, right? So he's this kind of vessel that the information comes from a higher realm, and that's somehow superior. And also it makes you seem like you're chosen for the work, right? And I'd always rejected that idea. I just thought we're all historically contingent people. And in the same way that Nabokov's sentences change when he moved from handwriting to the typewriter, our ideas are informed by our times. And so I start there. I don't think there is a kind of universal pool of knowledge that one taps into. I think we're just here and we write from here. And that also is informed by Buddhism. Karma, the result of action. Karma is often misunderstood in the West as repercussion or revenge, but the core definition is action and causation. So there's good karma, bad karma, what have you. And so for me, there are parts of my life, both beautiful and horrific, that most readers will never know, because I haven't been able to implement it into ideas. As a poet and novelist, I traffic in the world of ideas, whereas I think a journalist must traffic in facts first and see if those facts can accrue or ideas can come out of facts. For me, it's the ideas first. And so the autobiographical parts of my life that people are aware of, I've been able to weave into a system of ideas that are important to me. Whereas there are parts of my life that they're just there, they're just facts, but I haven't been able to corral them and implement them into a system of ideas. And I think that's the difference between just blank, confession and art, which is contrived and strategic. And so in this book, the first book was kind of like an artist statement. Unearthed Briefly Gorgeous was my way of using poetry and philosophy strategies and theory to then refuse to tell a story, right? And a lot of people get upset with that book because I didn't want to invite everybody to come into the theater of the book, grab popcorn and watch Vietnamese American pain, because I knew that was what expected of me. I knew everyone's going to come in, sit back. So I didn't want to tell a story. In fact, and instead, that book is more like a kind of treatise on thinking, right? So the materiality of composition is always felt in that first book. And I borrowed that from Baldwin, Baldwin's Go Tell on the Mountain. He knew, that was his debut, came out in the 50s. Baldwin knew at that time that the white literary establishment wanted him to give a tour of Harlem. He knew that, and that's how it was marketed. But what he did was really, really beautiful. And in that book, it's 300 pages. It lasts, the timeline of that book is only about 24 hours. And what he does instead was that he offers a portrait gallery of the formation of a Black family coming from the Great Migration. So that book moves in reverse. Every character is a doorway into the past. And it's similar to asking everyone to get on the tour bus. And then Baldwin gets on, grabs the mic and says, "We have no engine, no wheels, but I'm just going to talk to you for 300 pages. And so this novel, The Emperor of Gladness, is my attempt to kind of implement those ideas into action. And the idea that American life is a life that comes out of war. We measure time here with war. You ever try to rent an apartment and your realtor is like, "This is a post-war Greek revival. This is an antebellum ranch." I mean, you mean a former plantation? So go into any English department. The best novels, the best post-war novels, right? The greatest Civil War texts in the Victorian era. We measure success and catalog media and culture through violence. We also measure ourselves with violence. You're killing it, you're smashing it. And so I think I wanted to write a book wherein often we think of quintessentially American as two people living, thriving in the suburbs. This is like the mid-century John Cheever, John Updike, right? All those texts. But I thought quintessentially American is two people from two different continents, two different wars, 40 years apart, living under one roof, trying to make sense of the legacy of violence that they're inheriting.
So it's been, you talked about Unearthed We're Briefly Gorgeous. It actually wasn't the first book. I mean, obviously you were a poet first before you published Unearthed We're Briefly Gorgeous. And Night Sky with Exit Wounds was a significant work. It had a big critical and cultural impact as well. But many people probably associate you with Unearthed We're Briefly Gorgeous as the book they first read from you. And a lot has changed in your life, I assume, since that book. Now, when I first met you back in 2017, you were a first-time novelist and a poet, and we live in a society in which I think not a lot of attention is paid to poets and to poetry. Uh, but more attention is paid to novelists. And now you've made a second career for yourself. I don't know if career is the right word, but you've become a novelist in addition to being a poet. What's changed for you in the last several years? I mean, there's this relationship to art and form that we've been discussing, but the literature that we write and that we read is immersed in a material world. You talked about the histories of violence and warfare that have structured our notions of literature and periodization, but there's also the history of capitalism and commodification as well, in which books are treated as commodities, careers are treated as commodities, authors are treated as commodities. I'm assuming that the celebrity that has accrued around you, whether you wanted it or not, has in some way affected either your relationship to your writing and or your relationship to just how you move around in the world as a writer.
Mm. It's gotten louder for sure, but and you always have to resist that. I think resisting it has always been central to me. And things happen fast, but I've been a professional writer for 15 years. And so I kind of saw it all come. I got a crash course at it. I left home, went to New York at 17, and then just went to open mics and cut my teeth into that world. And so I was pretty hip on how destructive fame and all that could be. But again, I came to the page as a very seriously practicing Buddhist. I was going to be a monk before I became a writer. And it was a community college, is a high school guidance counselor that shifted my path. And I was going to go train in California at this place called University of the West, and I was going to go to Plum Village, shave my head. I had my mother's blessing. All that was set up. And then this fluke, guidance counselor said, why don't you just go to community college? It's free. And the Pell Grant could give you $5,000. And so at that time, my mother made $12,000 a year. We're living in Section 8 housing. So $5,000, I was like, oh my gosh, let me just maybe grab this bag and then give it to my mom and then be a monk. And then I got hooked. I went Comp 101. I still can't believe it to this day. Comp 101, Manchester Community College. The teacher was a former Harvard professor in retirement, and out of boredom, she taught this class. And so instead of teaching us to write respectable emails, which is what the idea was for these working poor students to get a job, she gave us the Milton Friedman papers. She gave us Annie Dillard, Baldwin, Camus. We studied the Lizzie Borden case. It was wild. And so I think for me, I always saw that this work was to understand the suffering of our world. And if I could support my family from it, this is the material condition, then I would fully go, head first into it. And interestingly, that's why I went to business school, to take care of my family. And that goal never changed, except that I was able to now take care of my family using my words and the books that I write. And so the cathartic fetishization of the artist in America, particularly the refugee or the artists of poverty, is that they escape. They get out, they leave the rest in the dust, and then they pull through or they rise above where they come from. And I've always rejected that notion because it fits with capitalism. It fits with the imperial fantasy that anything that is worthy must rise above, rather than creating systems that can fix and help the people there so that you don't have to escape to have dignity and a kind of autonomy. So I've come back, it's not always like the story that journalists and newspaper wants to hear, but it's always the goal for me. The goal was to make money to support my family. I live in New England. My family are all here. I'm here now. They all live in the Hartford area. My aunt still works at FedEx. My cousins are nail salon people. They work in factories. I'm very young, and my family is very young, right? My mother died at 51. My aunts are in their 50s. My cousins in their 20s and 30s. So I'm still there. Like I can't let go. And this is why I was really, there was another journalist that asked me, a la Annie Ernaux and the French working class writers. And they said, Annie Ernaux calls herself a class defector, a class traitor. And how do you contend with that? And I said, I can see that. It makes a lot of sense in her context. But why, when I think about it in my terms, it doesn't fit? And I realized like I can't leave, like, because the difference that she's a white woman in a white country, predominantly white country, that she can kind of just move and have no obligation to anybody around her. Whereas like I've had jobs offered from Stanford, Paris, Germany, nice, lovely jobs. As soon as they come in, I'm like, I can't go. I have to be here. And it's not even a burden. And many people in the diaspora would, I think, share this idea that I was talking to another Vietnamese woman who worked in business a few weeks ago. We met in Hartford at a fundraiser. And she said to me, I went off, I worked in corporate America, I was a corporate lawyer, I made a lot of good money. And then when my father got dementia, Alzheimer's in Hartford, immediately I said, I'm going home because my father is my home. It was not even like a negotiation. It was like, oh, I'm going to quit my job and then go home because that's always what it was. And I didn't realize that then. When I started off as a writer, I thought I was doing this bohemian, cool, rebellious thing. But I come to realize that it's actually the same story that so many of my Vietnamese American brothers and sisters go through, which is that we're trying to still take care of our family. And that was the hardest, the loneliest part of being specifically Vietnamese American in Asian American society. When I first got to, I'm sorry, it's a long-winded question, but when I first got to Hartford, to New York, I remember this very, very distinct moment where I was talking to an older poet. I won't say the name. I don't want, out of respect for him. But we were at this kind of party for his work, and I looked up to him. He had multiple books. He was telling me this beautiful story about his family and their migration, and we're sharing these stories just like you do when you bond. And I said, you should write about that somehow, like in whatever form. And he said something interesting where he said, oh, I don't want to pimp my family to white people. And while I understood that, there was a great sadness in me because I'm like, oh, wow, like here we are. This is a room full of Asian Americans. I have read all of his works. I'm sitting before him and he's not conceiving of me as a reader. That he couldn't fathom that the text could still be for us and that the white gaze was that powerful that it kind of sucked up all presumptions of his cultural production. And I realized something that I didn't understand before was that I grew up in a Black and brown community of immigrants, Haitian, Jamaican, Dominican, Puerto Ricans. And so I did not have, from age 2 when I came here to age 18, I did not live surrounded by the white gaze. And I didn't know that. It was just normal for us here, And so when I went to New York and I started to be surrounded by more Asian Americans, I realized that the Chinese Exclusion Act created a kind of vacuum of middle-class Asian Americans who were selected as high-skilled, allowed to come in, and their parents were lawyers and doctors and business people, and then they got to be academics. So artists and academics were predominantly from the middle class, but they were also grow up around the white gaze. So that moment of startling turned into great compassion, where I realized, wow, I don't know what it's like to be surrounded, to grow up beholden to that gaze and have to negotiate that gaze every single day, because I never had it. It wasn't important to how I thought. And then I realized, oh, because Vietnamese Americans were so temporally new. Like the model minority myth that they love to put Asian Americans in, high achieving, high educated, high earning. Vietnamese Americans don't fit in. We're grouped in, but we actually bring that number down, right? Because we have high suicide rates, high mental health, the multiple lack of GED, lack of high school graduation, because we are still new. The refugee experience have put us in this kind of impoverished position that we're still climbing out of, and yet we're pushed into this violent sort of monolith. And it's hard because a la Spivak very smartly says, sometimes you need to have strategic essentialism. And that's true too, where you have to corral together. You know that Asian American is a kind of false monolith, but you need to kind of come together to use a kind of community to kind of fight for your rights and represent each other. So there's so many contradictions therein, but I ran into that right away, and it was kind of like a galling moment because I grew up in a Black and brown community. I already had influence from Toni Morrison. My friend's mom, who was a highway patrolman, was reading Toni Morrison, and Morrison early on said, especially as an editor at Random House, she said, I know that most of my readers will be white, but it doesn't mean that I can't still intend to write for a Black woman. They're not mutually exclusive, right? So in the same way that Tolstoy, writing those books, never imagined a Black girl from Lorain, Ohio to be inspired by that. So I think I was really, really lucky in this sequence of knowledge to come upon Morrison way before, because I still think it was so shocking to me. Although I'm sympathetic to that moment and that elder, it was so shocking to me how easily he just assumed that this whole project was all either to satisfy whiteness or to deny its expectations. But what I saw was just somebody moving from one end of the cage to another.
You've been listening to the author Ocean Vuong on Accented, Dialogues in Diaspora, presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, or DVAN. DVAN's mission is to amplify diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian literary voices. We empower artists in the diaspora and champion our complex and diverse stories, ensuring our perspectives reshape and expand the broader cultural narrative. This conversation with Ocean Vuong will be available on our Spotify and Apple podcasts, released next Friday. And if you like what you're hearing, please consider donating to support the show. You can do so by visiting dvan.org/donate, or click the support link at the bottom of this episode's description. So we were talking about community, working class community, Asian American community, Vietnamese immigrant community, and the ambivalent position of writers within these communities, but also writers who are tempted to leave the community and go somewhere else and confront all the various kinds of misexpectations that you've described. I want to get a little bit deeper into the Vietnamese community and the questions of language and form. Because I think part of the tension sometimes is that when writers emerge out of their communities and they write their stories, sometimes people love what they write from the community, and sometimes people don't love what they like because of the paucity of representations that you've described, the anxieties of who is looking at these stories, who is making judgments on these stories. Maybe we're losing control of the stories of our community and they're being exposed by writers who we didn't even ask to write about us. But sometimes I think the relationship is much more positive. And I'm fascinated by this question of language in the Vietnamese language and how it affects your writing and my writing. One of the best experiences I've had sometimes is when Vietnamese fluent readers will say to me, it's happened a few times, even though you write in English, I can hear the rhythms of Vietnamese in the English. I'm wondering if what your relationship is to the Vietnamese language when you write in English. Is there some way that the Vietnamese language, whether it's vocabulary or rhythms or how it was spoken in your household, or the literature itself, has that in some way influenced the way you write?
Yeah, it's a dicey position because you don't want to, presume something you're not completely aware of. But I do think the subconscious is so real that you absorb things without really recognizing it. I think I realized that Viet most clearly through failure. When I started to have a proper Western education, literary education, I realized that the sonnet, the iambic pentameter, was just so, I was so violently opposed to its music. I watched the students around me, da 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 da, and even Hopkins sprung rhythm, like da 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 da. I was like, why are we doing this? Like it just, like why did you do this? Why did they do this for 300 years? Right? They couldn't switch up any other rhythm. It was like, look, I don't want to upset anybody, but to me, it was like techno music, which I can't stand, right? I'm like, it's like house, it's like, I'm like, what is happening? And I could not get myself to do it. And so I think what I realized, I was listening to there was another prosody that was informing me. Is it Vietnamese? Maybe, is it my father's Chinese? By the way, which is why, while we're here, I often pronounce my name as Vuong because that's how he pronounces it. Vuong comes from Vuong. I know it's Vuong in Vietnamese, but I want to acknowledge that my father's Chinese. He calls it Vuong as a kind of hybrid, but it's from that. It comes from Guangzhou, where he comes from, and his family lived in Jialeng, the Chinatown in Saigon. So that hybridization is already inflected in the language. And so I use Vuong to kind of indicate that because it's my father's name. That's how he pronounces it. So there you go. But I think the more I think about it, there's a kind of staccato to my rhythm. And I think maybe that's what the readers are also recognizing. Because I recognize it in your sentences too, Viet, like that kind of propulsive galloping. And it makes really a lot of sense when you listen to Vietnamese poetry or folk lyrics, right? Không có gì bằng cơm với cá, không có gì bằng má với con. Like the complexity of that rhyme, because the iambic pentameter is rhyming on the A, B, right margin. But in that couplet, there are diagonal rhymes, right? So it's almost like a zigzag, the rhyming pings backwards and forwards. It's so complex. And I think for me, when my sentences start to gallop like that, I know I'm on the right track. I'm kind of seeking out that cadence. Is it a Vietnamese cadence? Is it just music? Is it just resist? I don't know. Maybe if I was a tap dancer, I would say it was tap dancing. It's hard to pinpoint, but it has to come from somewhere, right? And why was it so difficult for me to assimilate to the Western rhythms? I could not do it. It was to the point where I felt like I must be like a bad poet because for the life of me, just hated iambic pentameter. It was so boring, monotonous. I needed some kind of break. And when I had the courage to finally do that, I started to really find my voice as a writer.
Well, I, for one, love techno music and house music, so there's a little bit
Sure.
but I love Vietnamese music too, and I don't know. I think that my own experience with the Vietnamese language is oftentimes of listening to it, of being talked to, not really engaging in a dialogue, because when my parents are talking to me or when the priest is talking and so on, could be interpreted as a drone, it could be interpreted as galloping, it could be interpreted as lyricism, depending on the mood of the speakers and myself as a listener. But that my relationship to the Vietnamese language has certainly shaped the way I think of my sentences as well. So we can continue talking all day long, but I have one last short question for you before we get to questions from the audience. And that is, if there is a Vietnamese word, a word in Vietnamese that feels untranslatable to you, and what does it carry? What meaning does it carry for you?
It would have to be buồn. And in a dictionary, it would mean sad. But I love Wittgenstein's idea that the meaning of a word is its use, not its definition. So how we use a word is really how the meaning of it. And the way the Vietnamese use buông is not as reductive and finite as sadness. You would look at a sunset and say, buông quá. And inside that, there's beauty, right? The Vietnamese use of buông, at times, not always, affords the idea of beauty. And I believe it's closer to what the Japanese call mono no aware, the idea that the beauty of something fleeting. My mother would see a landscape and say, ah, buông. Or I would take her to see paintings when she was alive, say, "Yeah, buồn quá con, cảnh buồn quá." And it wasn't bad, right? You would seek that out. You would hike up a mountain to look at a sunset, to look at a blistering, we were surrounded by winter in New England, and she would always say, "Ah, buồn quá," but it was not a negative term. And I love that idea as a deeper philosophy that sadness is also knowledge. Like everything about where we are now in our 21st century is like, oh, I'm sad, get rid of it. Take a pill, take a class, a yoga class, another retreat to get rid of, to purify. Again, the Western obsession of purification. And what that word affords is a complex and complicated relationship to beauty and sadness that also becomes a kind of knowledge. And I think that really informs my North Star of how I approach anything, which at its root has a kind of Taoist Buddhist philosophy at its kind of core as well.
One of our viewers says, is it similar to melancholy then? And I think that, I grew up in a Vietnamese community in which people, melancholy and sadness were ever-present symptoms and feelings in the community as a refugee community, feeling loss. And of course, these are in some ways terrible emotions to experience. But I also had the sense that Vietnamese people, at least the ones that I knew, sort of enjoyed certain elements of the melancholy as well. That's why you could look at the sunset and say, Buon Guai, and there's a feeling of melancholy, perhaps, as our viewer says. And I've been saying a few times more recently, Jiabon. I've had many occasions to say it. Jiabon literally means to share sadness or share sorrow is how I interpret it, because I usually use it in the context of someone's loss, someone's individual loss or in the collective loss. And obviously we're living at a time, I'm not sure when we're not living at a time, but we're living at a time when there's an aggravated sense of loss for so many people because of various things like genocide and deportation and so on. And this leads to our first audience question from Annette Liu, who asks, do you, Ocean, see any parallels between the Vietnamese experience with the war, I assume our war in Southeast Asia, and the current genocides in the world, e.g. Palestine, Sudan, etc.? How do you see the role of Vietnamese artists within this current context? Asking from Darugland in Sydney, Australia, where there's been neo-Nazi marches lately.
Oh, I mean, 100%. It's important to not map over discrete historical instances, right? I think we have to acknowledge that all this comes from imperial desires. The libidinal force of empire is what leads to destruction. And unfortunately, destruction is so efficient, but repair takes decades, if not more. And that's just materially. What about psyche and emotional and culture? And Vietnam understands that very well, not just with the Americans, but with the Japanese. By the way, I borrow a lot from Japanese culture and history, but I borrow it acknowledging that it too is an empire, and it modeled itself after England, another island that ruled the world, right? And so to me, it's all of that is replicated many times, not just what's happening now in Palestine and Israel, but it's replicated again and again. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the systems, the procedures, the process and strategies of empire are implemented, both overseas and then they implemented at home, right? These are all staging grounds to kind of evolve imperial forces. But it's also important not to say that, we are or we totally understand, because we don't want to map over our cultural, realities with Palestinians. I think it's really important to say we share this intimate understanding of how empire works, while still preserving the autonomy and the discretion of these other cultures. But I think it's very, I think about that a lot. I think about like what happens for the Palestinian poets and writers years from now, when they start to write about the yearning and the loss that they come through. And one thing that I often warn against is that, nowadays it's shameful in a way to be a diasporic writer, a writer writing about war and loss and yearning for home, right? Yearning for another place of our history. But it's important to remind ourselves that the diaspora is finite. With the Vietnamese diaspora, it's 1975 to 1995, 20 years, that's it. There's no more of it, right? Those are the refugees. Those are the bracket. So eventually, Vietnamese American life or Vietnamese life across the world will kind of outnumber the diaspora. So we only have this small window of very specific experiences. And now that if we shame, oh, you're writing about chopsticks and food, these cultural relics that you and your family yearn for, and you shame at that as kind of denigrating, what would happen to the Palestinian writers 20, 30 years now who are writing about the olive trees that have been burned and destroyed? Are we going to then shame them and say, oh, you're a diasporic writer, right? So I think I'm very disinterested in this kind of literary trend making, and I'm more interested in like, can the word hold historic memory and also afford each other, particularly intra-communally, the ability to romanticize. Like a romanticization is like the faux pas. You bring that word up in literary diasporic discussion, and it's like, don't touch it, don't do it. Interestingly enough, my mother would used to say something to me all the time. We had no TV, no radio growing up, and what we would do in Hartford in the summers was open the window and look out of our tenement. And she would say on many occasions, con ơi, mặt trăng ở Gò Công á, đẹp hơn mặt trăng ở đây. The moon in Gò Công is 10 times more beautiful than the moon in Hartford. And of course, she knows that can't be true. I know that can't be true, right? That's romanticization. But underneath the subtext, what is she really saying? I yearn for home. I miss my village. And that sentence becomes a sentence specifically from the diaspora. That is a sentence birthed from war and displacement. Because a Vietnamese person in Vietnam would never say that. It makes no sense. There's no contextual justification for a person in Vietnam to say, the moon tonight is more beautiful than it is in Hartford, Connecticut, right? It's just not there. That sentence comes from the imperial war in Vietnam. And it's important to honor that and also afford each other the grace to say that to each other. Because what happens when it's intra? I go back to that moment of me being so appalled that Asian American elder just presumed a white audience, because I said, oh, what happens when we speak to each other with metaphor? What happens when we long and romanticize amongst each other? In that case, my mother was showing me her pain without saying it outright. She was showcasing to me a kind of fantastical mythology that both of us knew was not real. But what it did reveal was that my mother did not come to this country by choice. There's another place that she thinks is more beautiful, and she can't live there. So the loss, the grief, the ghostness of that comes from the romanticization. Because, of course, you would not romanticize if you did not get displaced in the first place. So there is a role, particularly amongst each other, which is why Unearthed for Briefly Gorgeous is a conversation between one Vietnamese person and another. I had to start my novelistic debut closing that conversation. And so that anybody who's reading that book must eavesdrop on a conversation that is not about them if they are not Vietnamese Americans.
Oddly enough, that is the exact same description I've given of the Sympathizer, written deliberately as a confession from one Vietnamese to another, so that you can't translate if you're talking to another Vietnamese person. You can translate internal differences, like from different regions, different dialects, as some people have commented upon in our comments, but certainly you wouldn't translate some of the core ideas. And in some ways, you wouldn't have to translate what you just described, which is that sadness and romance and melancholy are all bound up with the diasporic condition or the exilic condition, no matter how you choose to say it, so that it does, in fact, fundamentally shape the way we see things, including the same moon that we all share can have different feelings. This next question is actually, for me, always the hardest question. I hate this question, but someone asked it. Annie N asks, for both authors, what are you currently reading, and what would you say is the one book that you will always recommend?
Oh gosh.
My mind always goes blank.
I do too, but after the flash of blankness, I always settle on Dictee by Teresa Ha Kyung Cha. A phenomenal book of just restless disobedience to expectations of genre, expectation of what an author is supposed to do. And in a way, that book is so brilliant from coming from the perspective of a visual artist, because I think to me, that book is as much a novel, a text, as it is an exhibit. She's kind of, it's the only book that I really saw that used the structure of the exhibit to kind of have a linear progression. It has images. It's all about Korean imperialization from the Japanese and then later from the Americans, displacement, speech, acts, the mother tongue, and mythology. She's borrowing from the muses, Joan of Arc, these ideas of revolutionary women, and then positioning her own mother within that canon. One of the most, to me, valuable moments of Asian American expression is disobedience, because so much of our signals symbol, or how we signify in this culture, has always been about service, right? We were forced to work in feminized, quote unquote, services, cleaning, cooking, maids, hospitality. And then we were expected as talent to then only serve European art via musical instruments, right? Playing Bach and Beethoven, right? We were kind of always the vessels for something else. And so it's important to me, one of the most important aspects of Asian American art making is disobedience, is to reject and say no. And I think that's why, and I'm curious if you get this as well, Viet, but like, I think that's why like a lot of folks, when they listen to us talk, when they listen to an Asian American face talk, they rarely get information from this face. Often information, even like the weather, comes from a white male face. And so immediately there's a kind of visceral reaction, not even to what you're saying, but that you're saying anything new, right? Or that you have your own ideas. And so they say, oh, this is pretentious. How dare he? Who does he think he is, right? There's a kind of reaction, but you have to fight through that and be disobedient to those expectations. And Teresa Ha Kyung Cha, both in her lived life, but also in that text, was disobedient through and through. And I can't even fathom, the white gaze being entertained in that text. And I think that's why I look to it again and again to re-inspire me.
One of the interesting things about that book, which I love as well and have taught many times and struggled with in a good way, is that in fact the first audiences that responded to her were the white avant-garde audiences. And Asian Americans had no idea what to make out of her. I'm not sure what her status is with Korean language audiences. So the idea of disobedience is certainly powerful in terms of disobeying, white power, white hegemony, white imperialism, but also disobeying like the mandates within our own communities, whether we define them in this case as Asian American or Korean American, may not want to hear what we have to say either. So some of my strongest critics are actually other Vietnamese people, not in addition to certain white Americans as well. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to end with one last question from the audience. Hopefully, it's an easy one for you. But an anonymous viewer asks, Ocean, what does your Vietnamese name mean to you in a world that often asks refugees and immigrants to translate or simplify themselves? How does your name shape your sense of identity and belonging?
Mm. Well, my name, in a way, belongs to my parents, and so that's kind of like the only inheritance from them that I've accepted. I think I can't, I have the body, I can't have no choice. And so there's things I reject from them, their ideas, the way, their mistakes. But the name is, I want to honor that. So the history of my name is very interesting because it comes both from my father and my mother. My birth name is Vuong Wook Vinh, which means literally the crown jewel of the nation, right? And he was inspired by Leslie Chung, Chung Wook Wing, right? So it's the exact same name, except instead of Chung, it's Vuong. And so Leslie Chung, the Hong Kong star and actor, was an icon to my father. And he named me after Leslie Chung, who's also named the crown jewel of the nation. Very hyperbolic. I'm still trying to live up to that. My problem is that I don't know what nation it is. Maybe just the imagination. Um, and then when they divorced, my mother renamed me Hai, which is ocean. And she always wanted that name. She loved that name as a kid. And so she said, I want to rename you this. So I honored that as well. And because she raised me, I keep that name. But I also am proud of, my father's sort of aspirational aspiring to get me to be a pop star. But I'm glad that that never manifested, at least not yet. Never say never, huh?
You've been listening to the author, the poet, the novelist Ocean Vuong on Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. Ocean, it's been such a pleasure to listen to you. I'm grateful for your time and your insights and your radical vulnerability as we started off our conversation. I'm thankful that you've drawn an audience literally from all over the world to listen to the podcast today. For those of you in the audience, please fill out the survey link. You'll see the QR code. Subscribe to our Instagram page at we_are_DVAN, DVAN. We're going to close out with a few more songs from DJ Tang and her selections of Vietnamese music. And once again, Ocean, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Viet. And I'm always inspired by you. And I always look to you to understand where we are. And I'm so grateful to be writing at the same time you are among you.
Me too. Me too. Thanks so much. Goodbye, everybody.